Hi, my name is Andrea Kupfer-Schneider, Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Marquette University. In honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and in recognition of how important women are in this current election, we are delighted to bring you our virtual conference on women's suffrage and innovation. How is innovation linked with voting? To understand both the history of the women's suffrage movement and the current evolution of voting rights is to examine innovation in political activism, intellectual empowerment, and inventive women. We hope you will enjoy all 8 segments on this important subject. Thank you for joining us.
Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I am Kristen Foster, Associate Professor of History here at Marquette University. It is my great pleasure to kick off our Suffrage and Innovation Conference with an introduction to our keynote speaker, Dr. Mary Kelley. She holds the Ruth Borden Collegiate Professor, Chair of History, American Culture, and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. We are so fortunate to have Professor Kelley, one of the great practitioners of early American women's history, join us today. Dr. Kelley's book, Learning to Stand and Speak, and today's keynote address should convince us all that there are important links between education, civic engagement, and voting in particular. She is the perfect person to start us off. Dr. Kelley's impressive body of scholarship explores the roots of women's struggle to find their voices when the country's laws and social mores in the earliest years of the Republic were stacked against them. Education, reading, and communities of conversation became their conduits for personal and national transformation. Through these practices, American women learned to stand up, to speak up, and eventually to rise up for change. As a scholar at the top of her fields, Mary Kelley was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2014. Kelley has held the Times Mirror Chair at the Huntington Library and has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Rockefeller Foundation. She has served on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians and the editorial board of numerous journals, including the Journal of American History, the Journal of the Early Republic, the American Quarterly, and the William and Mary Quarterly. And if that isn't enough, Kelley has been president of the American Studies Association and the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. And yet, with all of these accolades, Professor Kelley remains one of the most genuine and welcoming scholars I know. She is gracious, deeply thoughtful, sharply analytical, and a joy to listen to. Please join me for Dr. Mary Kelley's keynote address, Achieving Suffrage. Enjoy.
I want to thank Kristen Foster and her colleagues for inviting me to do this keynote for your conference, celebrating the achievement of suffrage. Indeed, being part of such a conference and celebrating this achievement is a signal honor for me. While we celebrate suffrage itself, we also consider an extraordinary movement that culminated in the 19th century, a movement a century long. We ask ourselves what factors contributed to this achievement. As a woman and gender historian, I have focused on women's educational opportunities and their intellectual empowerment in the long, very long 19th century. Today, I'd like to introduce you to women who claimed these opportunities and empowered themselves as thinking individuals. They stand among the women who were actors in one of the most profound changes in gender relations in the course of the nation's history, the movement of women into public life, a movement that made suffrage possible and that we continue to chart in our own times. Consider as an example Kamala Harris, who entered public life at a very early age. You'll recall that when she accepted the nomination and was with Joe Biden the other day, she told us that her parents had strapped her into her stroller and taken her to a civil rights demonstration when she was a toddler. She started early and she has not stopped since. Someone far, far before her is an important example, one that stands as calling for, let us achieve this, it is possible. Priscilla Mason. Priscilla Mason, a student of one of post-revolutionary America's earliest female academies, rose to the podium. The setting was Philadelphia Young Ladies Academy, which had been founded by Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a civic leader, and a social reformer. The speaker, Priscilla Mason, the class salutatorian. The date was 1793. Mason's address seemed conventional, at least at the outset, opening with a formulaic expression of gratitude to teachers and to trustees, and proceeded with an equally formulaic declaration of self-effacement. She was female. She was young. She was inexperienced, and more. On that day in May of 1793, she was, as she phrased it, addressing a promiscuous assembly, which meant an assembly or meeting of both women and men. What could she do but commence with an apology, as indeed she did, before her radical departure from a typical address on female learning for any 18th century American. Claiming the public role that males reserved for themselves, the right to participate in the nation's legal and political life, Mason defined this opportunity not as a privilege, but as a basic human entitlement that had been denied to women. Our high and mighty lords, as she said, in describing the party that she held responsible, had early on seized the scepter and the sword. With these, they gave laws to society. They denied women the advantage of a liberal education and forbade them to exercise their talents on those great occasions which would serve to improve them. Denunciations of the past were joined with declarations about a more auspicious present in which the promise of liberal learning might be fulfilled. Happily, Mason told listeners, the sources of knowledge are gradual to our sex. These altered circumstances had not yet erased the boundaries separating the public and the private, or, as she said pointedly, the church, the bar, and the Senate are shut against us. Men still presented an obstacle to women's religious, political, and legal development and empowerment. But if Mason thought men were intractable, she was confident that women could overcome their opposition and take for themselves the education that was their due. Speaking directly to her fellow students, Mason offered them a challenge enveloped in a promise. Let us, by suitable education, qualify ourselves for those high departments. They will open before us. Speaking at a moment in which post-revolutionary Americans were debating if and how women should be involved in public life, Priscilla Mason gestured to the future. She was prescient. Margaret Fuller. One might have presumed that Margaret Fuller, the author of the acclaimed Woman in the 19th Century, had actually read Priscilla Mason's address. Of course, she had not. And yet, in claiming a role for women in public life, Fuller did exactly what Mason had proposed. A full participant in antebellum America's world of letters, Fuller published essays of literary criticism, translations of German intellectuals, and reviews of contemporary literature, music, and art. She published Summer on the Lakes, a volume describing her travels west in 1843, and Woman in the 19th Century in 1845, a volume that has resonated through the 19th century, a volume that I read as a student in college and that I read virtually every year since then. It's been a while since I've been in college. Beginning in the summer of 1839, Fuller sponsored a series of conversations, her form of a literary society, as she called it, meeting at Elizabeth Peabody's bookshop on West Street in Boston. Members of the conversations addressed Greek mythology, the historic achievements and developments in the fine arts, and contemporary definitions of masculinity and femininity. We know from notes taken at those conversations that many of the discussions and the subject and how it was addressed about masculinity and femininity entered the pages of Woman in the 19th Century. Fuller suggested that although women and men had the same mental attributes, they had been combined, as she put it, in different proportions. It was not inherent, however, and it was only, as she put it, more or less. Did participants in the conversation agree with Fuller? She asked. Did they subscribe to the opinion that the differences were not essential, only more or less, and that they might be changed? What's crucial here is if you ascribe to the notion that they were grounded in gender conventions, they could be changed. Indeed, Fuller's rhetorical question had revolutionary implications. As she put it, it would follow, of course, that we should hear no more of repressing or subduing faculties because they were not fit for women to cultivate. The radical individualism driving Margaret Fuller's insistence that a woman could design for herself the manner in which she cultivated her faculties liberated all women from the restrictions imposed by prevailing gender conventions. Women could now look upon their intellectual potential as a principle of our perfection and cultivate it accordingly, and not excuse themselves from any duty on the ground that we had not the intellectual powers for it, that it was not for women to do, and, as she emphasized, on an intellectual ground. Positing sameness rather than difference, Fuller set forth a crucial alternative to the ascendant model of the morally superior woman who made the redemption of the nation her particular obligation. Instead, Fuller modeled the intellectually equal woman who was able to pursue individual opportunity as well as social duty. In other words, to behave exactly as men who were also expected to perform social duties. Whatever the topic of the conversations, Fuller's colleagues were dazzled by their leader's ability to gather threads from disparate sources and weave them into a tapestry of larger meanings. I have never heard, read of, or imagined a conversation at all equal to those that we have heard here, as one participant gathered and said about those meetings. Fuller's example was most important, obviously, for those who participated in the conversations. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of those individuals. She went with her husband to spend a winter in Boston, and during that winter, she attended the conversations. After she returned to her home in Western New York, Stanton inaugurated meetings in, as she put it, imitations of Margaret Fuller's conversationals. Stanton also invoked Fuller's spirit in the first speech she gave following Seneca Falls. Then fear not to wind the horn, Stanton told her listeners, ending her address with the poem of Fuller's that appears on the last page of Woman in the 19th Century. Stanton remembered the conversations Fuller led, as she put it, a vindication of woman's right to think, a vindication of woman's right to speak. Antoinette Brown and Lucy Stone. In the winter of 1847, teachers and students told at Webster Academy in Michigan also took the challenge that Priscilla Mason had posed 5 decades earlier. In debating the issue of women's rights, the exchanges in which they engaged were the same radical challenge as Mason's address and Fuller's conversations. Members of their literary society focused on educational, political, moral, and religious questions. As a social activist and future minister, Antoinette Brown told Lucy Stone. That description sounded relatively innocuous. In telling Stone that members who met weekly were displaying fearlessness and eagerness in the path of improvement, sounded a note of earnestness that was equally unobjectionable. That path, however, included the adoption of the persona with which Brown and Stone a graduate of Mount Holyoke Seminary who was completing her final year at Oberlin College, had already identified. We are all getting to be women's rights advocates, or rather, investigators of women's duties. What's crucial about this statement is she's now including the call for suffrage as part of one of those duties of women like herself. Brown, also a student at Oberlin who was teaching that winter, had learned the lesson that Mount Holyoke's founder, Mary Lyon, had taught all of her students, including Stone. In making claims on behalf of women, Brown took care to cloak any claim for rights in the language of obligation, which asked only that women be allowed to fulfill socially ordained responsibilities. And what better way to do it than if they had suffrage? However much Brown's rhetoric differed from Mason, she was an equally strong supporter of women's suffrage. She hoped that some of her students with whom she was debating this issue would stand with her, going out in the world pioneers in the great reform about to revolutionize society. The phrase "about to" was optimistic, unless she meant that this particular revolution would take 80 years, as it did. Brown and Stone would commit the rest of their lives to the enfranchisement of white women. Antoinette Brown Blackwell and her sister-in-law, Elizabeth Blackwell, would also pursue careers in two professions that had barred women. Brown Blackwell as the first minister of a regular Protestant church, and Blackwell as the first to take a degree in medicine, demonstrated that the exclusion that Mason had marked as the church, the bar, and the Senate were contingent. The end to the restriction on voting on candidates for the Senate or any other elected office would be achieved with the 19th Amendment. In that long struggle for women's suffrage, involvement in literary societies such as Margaret Fuller's Conversations or those at Elizabeth Brown Blackwell's Literary Society would prove to be crucial. 50 years and two distinguished careers later, Stone, reminded Brown it was there that he had learned to stand and speak. Learn to stand and speak. What then did intellectual empowerment mean? And why was it so important? In the wake of the Revolution and the establishment of the Republic, Judith Sargent Murray looked to a more radically transformed future than other members of her generation had anticipated. I expect, she declared in her collection of essays, plays, and poems she published in 1798, to see young women forming a new era in female history. Basing her claim on already visible changes in the schooling of women, Murray told readers, "Female academies are everywhere establishing." The presence of these schools demonstrated, as she put it, that studies of a more elevated and elevating nature were being integrated with the arts of the needle that had been thought sufficient for a woman's instruction. That Murray cast this achievement as a revolution testifies to the importance she attached to female education in changing the course of American women's history. Instead of educating women only in polite accomplishments, as they were called, which included instrumental music, dancing, penmanship, drawing, and needlework, students at female academies and seminaries would be taught the same curriculum as their peers were receiving at male colleges. That curriculum included grammar, geography, history, physiology, rhetoric, chemistry, and astronomy. There were also literary societies at these schools that schooled participants in public speaking and debate. Equally important, these institutions provided students with examples of independent women exercising authority. Let me conclude with a personal anecdote or a personal remembrance myself. I attended one of these colleges. I'm a graduate of Mount Holyoke College. And when I went there, I didn't think too much. I went there when all the Ivy League was confined to males, and women were typically seen as going to places like Mount Holyoke. They were called Seven Sisters. I didn't think too much about any of that. I didn't think too much also about the fact that there were certainly men who were instructors at Mount Holyoke College, and the man when I was there, and the president when I was there, was a man. But there were also many women in positions of authority as teachers and administrators. I saw it, I experienced it, and I graduated. When I graduated, I did not go to graduate school immediately. Instead, I took a position at Time magazine as a researcher. And the very moment I walked in the door, I saw this particular hierarchy that was established. Men wrote, women researched. I thought this was peculiar. I did not think there was any reason for this, because women's minds were the same as men's minds were the same as women's. And yet this was a hierarchy that had been established and persists for many years. It was that hierarchy and what it meant in terms of women entering public life that started me on my education. In a further sense, I took a master's degree at New York University while I was working at Time, and then left Time. By the time I left that institution and went to graduate school at the University of Iowa, I was committed to the study of women's history. And it was a field that was opening at that point. And that experience, both at Mount Holyoke and then later in the labor force, persuaded me that it was important to reconstruct what had happened, what women's history was, and what its promise entailed for all women in the present as well as in the history, So for me, all of that came together in this personal experience that set the agenda that still continues to guide me. Again, what these places did for women was to establish for them the tools to fully participate as equals in America's social and political life, public life. Or as Brown said, once again, students learned to stand and to speak. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the entire Planning Committee, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please check out the other segments of our conference on our website. And please do let us know how you utilized the resources provided. Our feedback form and email address are also located on our website. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, remember to vote.